racist resort staff tried to humiliate Michelle and Barack Obama, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. The summer sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in deep gold and crimson as Barack Obama rested his arm on the open car window, letting the evening breeze ruffle his shirt sleeve. Beside him, Michelle gazed out at the rolling landscape, taking in the scattered villas nestled among the lush greenery. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her voice carrying a note of relief, like she was finally allowing herself to breathe after months of relentless pressure. Barack chuckled. "I think this is exactly what we need." "Agreed," she said, turning to him with a teasing smirk. "Though I'm a little concerned, what if a whole vacation without speeches and meetings ruins your rhythm?" He laughed. "I think I'll survive, Mrs. Obama. Even I deserve to just be me for a while." As their car pulled into the grand entrance of the exclusive resort, the scene was picture perfect. Tall palm trees swayed lazily, framing a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with elegant arches and terracotta roofs. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, a rare escape from the world's constant gaze. But the moment they stepped into the lobby, Michelle felt something was off. The receptionist's smile was polished but hollow, her eyes flickering with something unreadable as she registered their faces. A quick glance toward her colleague, a hushed whisper, subtle but unmistakable. Barack, ever the diplomat, handed over their reservation details with his usual warmth. "We're looking forward to our stay." The receptionist hesitated, just a beat too long, before responding. "Of course. Welcome to Lestrella. One moment, please." As Michelle scanned the room, she noticed other guests being checked in smoothly, their greetings warm, effortless. Yet, here they were, facing delays, exchanged glances, and hushed conversations behind the desk. When their key was finally handed over, it came with an apologetic smile. "There was a mix-up with your reservation," the receptionist said smoothly. "For now, we've placed you in one of our garden view suites. We'll do our best to resolve the issue as soon as possible." Michelle shot a glance at Barack. This wasn't what they'd booked. Their reservation had been clear, an ocean view suite, top-tier amenities. But before they could object, the receptionist added, "Our manager will follow up with you tomorrow to ensure your stay meets expectations." Escorted to their room, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this mix-up wasn't a mistake at all. The suite, while tastefully decorated, lacked the luxury they'd expected. Instead of the promised ocean view, their windows overlooked a modest garden, and a faint musty smell lingered in the air. Michelle sat on the edge of the bed, forcing a chuckle. "Well, this is definitely the most understated luxury suite we've ever had." Barack smiled, ever the optimist. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it's just a busy season. We'll sort it out tomorrow." But Michelle wasn't convinced. She replayed the subtle cues from the lobby, the whispers, the lingering stares, the inexplicable delay. Something didn't add up. That evening, they wandered through the resort, taking in the perfectly manicured lawns, the sparkling pools, the golden glow of pathway lanterns. The setting was stunning, yet Michelle couldn't shake the unease. Other guests cast side glances in their direction, curious, some even judgmental. It wasn't overt, but the undertone was there, a silent message that they didn't quite belong. Dinner only confirmed her suspicions. Seated near the back of the restaurant, they waited. And waited. While other tables enjoyed prompt service and warm conversations with their waiters, Michelle and Barack were left on the sidelines, ignored, orders mixed up, their waiter avoiding eye contact. Michelle watched, noting how effortlessly other guests were treated, smiles, small talk, gestures of genuine hospitality. Their table? A stark contrast. Barack reached across the table, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "You okay?" She forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just observing." "Don't let it get to you," he said softly. "It's just our first day. Things will settle." But deep down, Michelle wasn't so sure. As they walked back to their room, the stillness of the night felt heavier than before. Something told her this was just the beginning. And what happened next? No one could have predicted it. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. What happened to Michelle and Barack Obama at this resort will shock you. Subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. Anticipation had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Michelle stole a glance at Barack, who seemed lost in thought. Whatever this was, it wasn't what they had expected, and though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew this was just the beginning. The morning after, sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, bathing the suite in a warm golden glow. Michelle stirred first, her sleep restless, her mind still tangled in the events of the previous evening. As she sat up and took in her surroundings, the unease crept back in. This place, meant to be their haven, felt anything but. Barack was already awake, seated by the small writing desk near the window, a cup of coffee in hand. His expression was calm, but Michelle caught the faint crease in his brow, a telltale sign that his thoughts were heavy. "Good morning," she murmured, crossing the room to sit beside him. "Morning," he replied gently, eyes meeting hers. "How'd you sleep?" She shrugged. "Could have been better." "You?" He let out a knowing sigh. "Same." After a pause, he added, "Let's give today a chance, though. See how things unfold." Michelle nodded, but deep down, the previous night's whispers and glances still lingered in her mind. She wanted to stay open-minded, but something told her this wasn't just a one-off incident. If this was the beginning of a pattern, she wouldn't let it slide. Breakfast on the terrace. They arrived early, hoping to enjoy a quiet breakfast with the ocean glistening in the distance. The terrace was already bustling, couples and families chatting over white linen tables, laughter mixing with the sound of rolling waves. They chose a table near the edge, craving a peaceful start to the day. A waiter arrived, polite but distant, barely making eye contact as he took their order before quickly disappearing. Then they waited. And waited. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. Around them, other tables, guests who had arrived well after them, were already being served. Plates of eggs, fresh pastries, and fruit made their way to smiling diners, while Michelle and Barack's table remained conspicuously empty. When the waiter finally returned, it was only with part of their order. Michelle noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he set the plates down, his gaze deliberately avoiding hers. "I'll bring the rest shortly," he mumbled before hurrying away. Barack leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral, but Michelle caught the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "It's just breakfast," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Michelle tilted her head. "Is it?" Her voice was low but firm. "Because this feels deliberate." Barack exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe it's just disorganization." She didn't argue, but her instincts told her otherwise. A day at the beach, or so they thought. The resort's private beach had been one of its main selling points. A stretch of pristine white sand, turquoise waves lapping at the shore, shaded loungers lying neatly beneath oversized umbrellas. But as they arrived, that familiar feeling of something being off returned. The loungers they had specifically reserved? Already occupied. Michelle flagged down a beach attendant, expecting a quick fix. Instead, his response was clipped, dismissive. "Sorry, but we can't move guests once they're settled." Michelle's jaw tightened. "We reserved these loungers when we booked. Surely there's a way to sort this out?" The attendant still wouldn't meet her gaze. "I'll see what I can do." Then he walked off, without an ounce of urgency. Barack touched her arm gently. His voice was low, soothing. "Let's just find a spot and enjoy the beach. It's not worth ruining the day over." But for Michelle, it wasn't just about the loungers. It was about the principle. This wasn't just bad service. This was a pattern. The subtle but unmistakable pattern. As the day went on, it became impossible to ignore. Housekeeping never arrived to clean their suite, despite repeated assurances that someone was on the way. When Michelle called the front desk to inquire, the response was vague, "We'll send someone shortly." No one ever came. As they walked through the resort grounds later, she noticed the way other guests reacted to them. Some cast curious glances. Others looked away too quickly, as if deliberately avoiding eye contact. A few whispered among themselves, their expressions unreadable: surprise? Judgment? Something darker? And then came dinner. The most blatant insult yet. Seated near the back of the restaurant, away from the main dining area, Michelle and Barack found themselves in an all too familiar situation. The waiter assigned to their table seemed hesitant. His body language stiff, his demeanor polite but cold. Conversations flowed effortlessly at other tables, but here, just a strained silence. Orders arrived late. Incomplete. By now, Michelle wasn't just suspicious. She was certain. This wasn't just negligence. This was intentional. And what happened next? Nobody could have predicted it. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. What happened to Michelle and Barack Obama at this resort will shock you. Subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from. The breaking point. The waiter's demeanor had been off all evening, distracted, forgetful, taking an inexplicable amount of time to fulfill even the simplest requests. Michelle had watched him move through the restaurant, noting the stark contrast in his attitude toward other guests. When he spoke to them, he was animated, warm, engaged. With Michelle and Barack? Cold. Distant. And then came the final straw. When the waiter finally returned, he set Barack's plate down with a careless clatter, spilling sauce onto the crisp white tablecloth. "Apologies," he muttered, though the word carried no real sincerity. Michelle exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Then, with deliberate calm, she asked, "Is there a problem?" The waiter hesitated. His discomfort was palpable. "No, ma'am. Everything's fine." Barack, ever the peacemaker, reached for Michelle's hand under the table, a silent plea for restraint. But Michelle wasn't letting this slide. "Because it feels like there is," she continued, her tone even but firm. "This isn't the level of service we expected when we booked this trip." The waiter stiffened, nodded curtly, and walked away without another word. Michelle's frustration simmered beneath the surface. But deeper than that was something more, something she'd known since childhood. That feeling of being made to feel out of place. An unexpected ally. Later that evening, as they sat in their room, the weight of the day hung heavy in the air. Michelle sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "This isn't just bad service," she said at last. "It's something more. You feel it too, don't you?" Barack met her gaze, silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he exhaled. "I do." Michelle steadied his face, waiting. "But I also know that reacting too strongly can sometimes backfire. We have to choose our battles." She nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She had spent her whole life navigating these moments, subtle slights, quiet exclusions, the unspoken but unmistakable signals. And now, here they were again. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, a young housekeeper stood there, her dark eyes wide, her expression nervous. "I'm sorry for the delay in servicing your room," she said softly. "Thank you," Michelle replied warmly. "We appreciate it." As the woman stepped inside, Michelle noticed her hesitancy, how she moved carefully, as if afraid of making a mistake. But when Michelle complimented her on her meticulous work, something shifted. A small, brief smile. A flicker of something, relief? Gratitude? Then, as she turned to leave, the woman hesitated. And in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "If you ever need anything, just ask for me. My name is Lukia." Michelle watched her go, a strange sense of connection lingering in the air. There was something in Lukia's eyes. A quiet understanding. Maybe even solidarity. A small moment. But it stayed with her. The moment everything changed. Barack was up early the next morning, slipping out of bed without waking Michelle. The events of the past 2 days had left him restless. He stepped onto the small balcony, inhaling the salty air as the ocean stretched endlessly before him, a stark contrast to the unease twisting inside him. When Michelle joined him, her expression mirrored his. They didn't need words. They both knew the truth. This wasn't just bad service. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a message. Still, they had no clear plan on how to proceed. Were they just guests encountering bad treatment? Or was something deeper at play? After another tense breakfast, where their waiter barely acknowledged them, they decided to walk the resort grounds. And that's when the final veil of civility was ripped away. What they overheard changed everything. Barack had wandered ahead, drawn to a small, secluded garden behind the main building. Michelle lingered behind, admiring the vibrant flowers that lined the path. Then she saw him. He stood at the garden's edge, posture rigid, face unreadable. Something was wrong. Michelle stepped closer, following his gaze toward a conversation happening just out of sight. And as she neared, the voices became clear. "I don't care who they are," a man said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "This isn't the kind of place for them. We need to maintain a certain image." Another voice, softer, nervous, responded. "But they're high-profile guests. If they complain..." "They won't," the first man interrupted. "People like them know better than to make waves." The words hit Michelle like a physical blow. She stepped closer to Barack, her presence snapping him out of his trance. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Without hesitation, Barack turned, guiding her away with a firm hand on her arm. Back in their suite, the silence between them was heavy. Then, Barack pulled out his phone, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "I recorded part of it." Michelle sat on the bed, hands clasped tightly. "We can't ignore this, Barack. If we let it go, we're complicit." He nodded, but his voice was weary. "I know. But we need to be smart about how we handle it. This isn't just about us, it's about everyone who comes here and gets treated the same way. Or worse." And just as the weight of that truth settled between them, there was another knock at the door. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The whistleblower. A knock at the door shattered the quiet tension of the evening. Michelle opened it to find Lucia, the same housekeeper who had cleaned their room the day before. But this time, there was something different about her. Her expression was cautious, but urgency flickered in her eyes. "I need to speak with you," she whispered. Michelle stepped aside, and Barack gestured for her to sit. Lucia hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if checking for unseen eyes. "I shouldn't be here," she admitted, wringing her hands. "But I overheard something this morning. And I thought you should know." The words came tumbling out in hushed urgency. She had witnessed a meeting between the resort's management team. They hadn't just discussed how to downplay Michelle and Barack's complaints, they had explicitly strategized ways to ensure that certain guests, particularly those deemed more fitting, received impeccable service, while others didn't. It was a quiet, calculated system. A system of exclusion. A system that had been in place long before the Obamas had arrived. Michelle listened, her anger simmering with each word. The language had been veiled, wrapped in polite corporate phrasing, but the intent had been clear. "I've worked here for 3 years," Lucia confessed. "And it's always been like this. Staff like me, immigrants, people of color, we're treated like we're less than. And when guests like you come, it's worse. They don't want you here. Because you don't fit their idea of who belongs." Barack leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Why are you telling us this?" he asked. "You're putting yourself at risk." Lucia hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Because I'm tired of being afraid," she said. "And because I think you can do something about it." Her words lingered in the air long after she left. Michelle turned to Barack, her resolve hardening. "We can't just let this slide." "I know," he said, nodding. "But we need to be careful. If we act too soon, without enough evidence, they'll dismiss us as overreacting. But if we wait too long, the moment might pass." And so, they waited. And watched. And gathered everything they needed. The evidence mounts. The next few days became a quiet operation. They documented everything. The dismissive service. The whispered conversations. The stark contrast in how different guests were treated. Slowly, they spoke to more staff. Some were hesitant, but enough shared what they knew to confirm what they had suspected all along. This was systemic. It wasn't just a bad experience. It was by design. Then, during dinner one evening, everything boiled over. Their waiter, the same one who had fumbled their orders before, was carrying a tray when, suddenly, a full glass of red wine tipped forward, spilling directly onto Michelle's dress. The restaurant hushed. Conversations dulled. Gasps. Stares. The waiter barely mumbled an apology before hurrying off. It wasn't just negligence. It was blatant. Michelle dabbed at the stain, keeping her composure. But inside, she was seething. Back in their suite, she finally let the frustration spill out. "This isn't just rudeness," she said, pacing. "This is deliberate. They want us to feel like we don't belong." Barack nodded, but his focus remained on the bigger picture. "We're getting close," he said, reviewing the footage and notes they had gathered. "One more piece. Something undeniable. And we take this public." Their opportunity came sooner than expected. The smoking gun. It happened during a walk through the resort grounds. Barack had wandered ahead, drawn to a quiet garden tucked behind the main building. Michelle, a few steps behind, stopped to admire the flowers. Then she heard voices. Sharp. Heated. And when she turned the corner, she saw him with Barack, standing frozen, his face unreadable. He was listening. Michelle crept closer. And then, the words reached her ears. "I don't care who they are," a man was saying, his voice cold, clipped. "This isn't the kind of place for them. We need to maintain a certain image." Another voice, nervous, uncertain, responded. "But they're high-profile guests. If they complain." "They won't," the first man cut in. "People like them know better than to make waves." Michelle's stomach tightened. Barack turned to her, his face hard. Without a word, he took her hand and guided her back toward their suite. When the door shut behind them, Barack held up his phone. "I recorded it," he said. His voice was calm, but Michelle could hear the fire underneath. Michelle sat down, exhaling sharply. "This is it," she said. "This is what we needed." That night, they didn't sleep. They compiled everything, the service, the whispers, the treatment of staff, the direct discrimination, and now, the proof. By the time they were done, they had built a case that was impossible to ignore. And they knew exactly what to do with it. The moment the world found out. The next morning, they made their move. Armed with their evidence, they reached out to a journalist they trusted. Someone with a reputation for uncovering systemic injustice. Someone who wouldn't let this go. Within hours, the story was in motion. And by the time Michelle and Barack stepped out of their suite, they could feel the shift. The resort had changed. Guests who had once ignored them now cast furtive glances. Some filled with curiosity. Others with shame. The staff, those who had always been polite but restrained, held themselves differently. And the management? Nowhere to be seen. The news was everywhere. The resort's carefully curated image had begun to crumble under the weight of truth. And for Michelle and Barack, this was only the beginning. A fight far bigger than a single resort. A fight for every person who had ever been told, subtly or explicitly, "You don't belong here." But now the world knew. The aftermath of the expose. As Michelle and Barack walked toward the main building, they felt the weight of their decision. The story had been published the night before, triggering shock, outrage, and growing calls for accountability. Yet, from the resort's management, silence. No apologies. No damage control. Just a forced illusion of normalcy that only deepened the tension. Barack, always the strategist, had spent the early hours reviewing the article's reception. They'll try to frame this as an isolated incident, he had told Michelle. We need to make it clear this is systemic. We're not backing down, she had replied. At breakfast, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations hushed, staff hesitated, and even their usual table was left conspicuously empty. Refusing to be sidelined, Michelle led Barack to a central spot, a quiet statement that they would not be ignored. Their waiter, visibly nervous, fumbled through the interaction, while diners stole glances, torn between sympathy and discomfort. Before they could discuss their next steps, a familiar voice interrupted, "Look here." She hesitated before sitting, glancing around as if afraid of being watched. "I wanted to thank you," she whispered. "But you should know, they're trying to find out who talked to you." Michelle took her hand. "We won't let anything happen to you. You have our word." Barack leaned in. "Look here, we're not done. If there's more, now's the time." Her voice wavered but didn't break. "It's been like this for years. The way they treat us, the way they treat guests who don't fit their image. If we speak out, we lose our jobs, or worse." Her words confirmed what they already knew. This was never just about bad service. It was systemic exclusion. Gathering more evidence. Determined to act, Barack and Michelle worked to collect more testimonies. Staff members, hesitant at first, slowly began to open up, stories of unequal pay, verbal abuse, and a rigid hierarchy favoring certain guests and employees. That same day, management finally broke their silence. A mass email arrived, carefully crafted to downplay the allegations while promising an internal review. Michelle read it aloud, scoffing. "Inclusivity and excellence," she said, sarcasm dripping. "Is that what they call discrimination now?" Barack placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's damage control. But we've got momentum. Let's make sure they can't spin this." That evening, they met secretly with staff, including Lukia. One by one, employees shared their experiences, some near tears, others emboldened by the chance to finally be heard. Lukia spoke last. "I've seen people broken by this place. Good people. We deserve better." Michelle reached for her hand. "And we're going to fight for that. This isn't just about exposing the truth, it's about making sure things change." The resort strikes back. The next morning, the story exploded. More media outlets picked it up, amplifying staff voices and guest experiences. Public pressure mounted, and the resort struggled to contain the fallout. Then, the retaliation came. A legal notice arrived at their suite, a defamation lawsuit. The resort accused them of damaging its reputation and demanded a retraction. Michelle read it twice before handing it to Barack. "They're trying to intimidate us," she said. His jaw tightened. "Let them try. The truth is on our side." Instead of backing down, they doubled down. They provided more evidence to the press, exposing the resort's culture of exclusion. A televised interview further cemented the truth: this wasn't just about them. This was bigger. And then, the final blow. A leaked email surfaced from a former employee, proof that management had knowingly enforced discriminatory policies. The resort's defenses collapsed. Senior staff were fired. The company issued a public apology. But to Michelle and Barack, it felt hollow, a desperate attempt to save face. As they packed to leave, Michelle glanced at Barack. "This isn't over." "Not by a long shot," he agreed. Beyond the resort, a movement begins. As they headed to the airport, they knew the story had become bigger than they'd imagined. News outlets framed it not just as a scandal, but as a symbol of deeper inequalities and exclusive spaces. Inside the terminal, a young woman approached, clutching a notepad. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "I just wanted to thank you for speaking out. It means so much to people like me." Michelle smiled. "What's your name?" "Amara. I'm a student journalist." Barack gestured for her to sit. "You don't need our permission to tell the truth, Amara. Just remember, the real story isn't just what happens. It's why it happens and how it can change." Amara nodded, pen poised. "Can I quote you on that?" They laughed, the tension momentarily lifted. But the fight was far from over. The long road ahead. Back in Washington, the media storm didn't die down. The story had ignited conversations about privilege, discrimination, and inequality in the hospitality industry. But with traction came backlash. Online trolls attacked them. Industry lobbyists fought against regulation. And the resort, despite dropping its lawsuit, quietly worked to rebuild its image. One night, after an exhausting day of interviews, Michelle sat scrolling through messages. Among the hate, one stood out. It was from Lukia. "Because of you, I'm no longer afraid to speak up. I've joined a group fighting for change. I'll never forget what you did for us." Michelle swallowed the lump in her throat and showed Barack. He read it silently before looking at her. "This is why we do it." The turning point. The resort's CEO made a crucial mistake. During a live news segment, he dismissed the staff testimonies, attempting to frame the controversy as a misunderstanding. The next day, another bombshell email leaked. This one confirmed everything, a directive from upper management explicitly enforcing discriminatory policies. The public backlash was immediate. The company had no choice but to issue a formal apology, terminate senior executives, and implement policy changes. Michelle and Barack had won. But they both knew it wasn't enough. More than a resort, a cultural shift. Weeks later, as they sat on their porch, Michelle stared into the distance, still processing everything. "We exposed the truth," she said. "But what if nothing really changes?" Barack set down his papers and met her gaze. "It won't fade," he said. "Because we won't let it. And neither will the people we've inspired. This isn't just about us, Michelle. It's about everyone who sees this and decides to fight back." She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Then we keep going. For as long as it takes." The fight wasn't over. But a spark had been lit. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a fire. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and explore more stories. If this one resonated with you, share it, because together, we can inspire change.